Hello, welcome to the first PowerPoint of Nursing 418, the research course. I'm going to be talking today about integrating research and evidence-based practice. I have done this recording for people who may be more audio and less visually stimulated in terms of learning. I do know that some people prefer just visual, and feel free to not watch these and listen to these videos. I certainly recommend you look over the content because that will help you focus on materials you need for life and for the exam. But if you do benefit from hearing things, this might be a good way for you to learn. So today we're going to be talking about learning outcomes related to research, and as a bachelor's nurse you will be expected to know how to apply research to your everyday practice. And so today, to build on that, we're going to talk about how to appreciate the relevance of research in clinical activities, how to identify the components of critical thinking and critical reading in terms of research, and then differentiate between evidence-based practice, systematic reviews, and clinical practice guides and guidelines, and then to identify the format and parts of research articles, and finally to differentiate between quantitative versus qualitative research articles. And there will be a lot of information about quantitative versus qualitative, and I highly recommend that you write those words down and know the difference between those two, because that will come up again and again in this semester, and knowing those words and understanding what that means will be very helpful in terms of applying this knowledge and also taking tests, because it will be on the test, I can guarantee that. So what is research? It means to search and to discover, and that's what nursing research is about. Formal definition might be to research is a systematic, vigorous, logical investigation that answers questions about nursing phenomena. And we say nursing here, but there's a variety of different types of research that done by nursing. It might be related to community health, which could relate to nursing, maybe not directly. Also, there's a lot of educational research that's done, which is still done by nurses, but it's not necessarily nursing phenomena. So I think that it might even be a little broader than this slide discusses. So the process of research, it begins with a knowledge of the world of nursing, or at least clinical practice. Identify a problem. It might be, once again, clinical or possibly related to education. Could be related to education of a patient, of a nurse. So you're a nurse manager and your staff are having issues learning about a new piece of equipment. That might be something that is clinically based but also educational. Patients might be having problems in terms of how to learn injections, administration of insulin or insulin pumps, things like that. So then there's development of design and methodologies to answer the question. So what kind of process is another good word for methodology. Sometimes you hear people say methodology. Collected data, analyze data, then formulate outcomes or findings, and then hopefully disseminate and publish in a journal or some sort of magazine. Websites are now being used a lot, just because it can be quite hard to publish in a journal. So there's a variety of different research. This picture is a picture of research done with children on how to identify what's going on with their life after a hurricane. Sometimes it's not just necessarily a survey, answer 1 through 5, how do you feel about this, but pictures, words, expressions, blood pressure. I know a lot of people who do research by looking at the sweat on their fingers. So there's lots and lots of places to get data in order to research and do discovery and finding. Research is not tradition. We just don't say we've always done this way, so we're always going to keep it. We're not borrowing. We're not taking other people's ideas that may not relate to what we're doing. Certainly looking at other fields of healthcare and even other areas related to maybe engineering, related to education, it's really, really important. But we want to also do our own research to make sure that what might be applicable in one area that's non-nursing would apply to nursing. It's not trial and error. It's just not just guessing and doing intuition, or I feel this way. It's more systematic. It is a personal, it can be personal, but we need to also step aside and observe and make some non-judgmental assessments of what's going on. And it's not just reasoning in terms of, oh, I think this is the way it should be. How research is relevant to clinical practice is that research provides evidence for evidence-based practice. In other words, research is done and then we figure out how that might best apply to the clinical setting, particularly things like maybe stress research and how people cope. We have to do some like translation in a way from what the researcher finds to how we can best apply that through our clinical practice. Using research in practice is really important. There's some health organizations that really focus on evidence and evidence-based research. The Joint Commission of Hospital Accreditation is one of them. You'll hear about people benchmarking and best practices, and that can be medical centers or healthcare centers throughout the world. Signigus Clinic Study is another one in which practice and research are combined. Evidence-based practice is collecting, interpreting, and integration of research findings through clinical expertise, and it includes patient and family values and preferences. Once again, we need to take the information and see how does this work for us, and how does it work for our patients and our situation. What might work in a big city may not work in community and rural areas, so we need to see, does this really fit our community? Does it really fit the people we're working with? Keystones in terms of sources of evidence, certainly patient concerns. Patients bring up a problem or we see it consistently. That helps us think about, okay, what's best practice? Just having experience as a clinical nurse is very important. Looking at data and research and what's going on are important. Best practices, looking at what do the best hospitals do and how do they do it. We can bring all that together as we look at evidence-based practice. There are systematic reviews that are done with research, and they help to summarize data and focus on clinical questions. You might hear people talk about an integrative or narrative review in which they look at quantitative studies, like studies that might use surveys or might use some data collection, and see, how do these fit together. If they take a lot of different studies and work and put them together and do analysis, for example, they might look at practices for chemotherapy administration and say, this research subject said this is the best way to do it, and this one said this and this and this and this and this. And taking all this together, this is how we should practice, and that would be in meta-analysis, and you'll find some of those in the literature. A meta-synthesis is very similar. It's using qualitative studies, so ones in which they're kind of looking more at feelings and emotions and more descriptive, not survey sorts. And we'll talk about the difference between quantitative and qualitative a little bit later. Those ones looking at qualitative are called, and then comparing qualitative studies, it's called a meta-synthesis. You will see clinical practice guidelines. There are some organizations like the Cochrane database that says, this is what we found in terms of best practices for care. They have different things like wound care, infectious control, and things like that. They say we've studied it well, and this is what we should be doing as healthcare providers. There are also organizations that provide some direction in terms of management, and that's research-based. Things like the American Academy of Pediatrics has guidelines, and also there are some related to asthma and asthma control. Before we use anything, we need to take a look and see, does this make sense? Is the research being evaluated and integrated in an appropriate way so that we know that it's working? And that can be done through looking at what's called critical thinking. Critical thinking, people with critical thinking abilities are able to distinguish between fact, assumptions, and inferences. So they're able to kind of cut through what's being said here. Does this make sense? Are there some things that are being said that maybe don't, and what should we do about that? Idea is to identify key concepts and methods, to identify gaps in pertinent information. Maybe someone says, oh, this is the best diet product that's ever been ever been brought to the market. I hear this a lot on the radio, but they don't really say, well, how do they know that it's the best? And what is the information they're using? And a nurse is going to look at that. We can also look at the information. What kind of literature is out there? Does it support the assumptions or not? And we always need to question the methods. If study says that we found that when we implement this infectious disease process within our facility, our infections fall, by 30%, and then you read more and it's like, well, they used that, but they also did a couple other things. And so then you have to think, well, did they really do this study well? Are these the results that we really are expecting and make sense to us? So we want to find that the conclusions are based on the study findings and not just randomly chosen or pulled from evidence that's only partial. So as people critically think, they want to preliminary understand, kind of take a look at and skim. And sometimes as a nurse, there's just too much out there, so you can't really look deep into everything. But being aware of the literature and what's out there is important. So sometimes we do some skimming. But really, in terms of practice and applying it to practice, you want to have a pretty good comprehension of what's going on before you start working, implementing some research findings. So we want to analyze and understand and break things into parts and then synthesize, think of it wholly. If you really get a good grasp of what's happening, that would be the best for applying any research to practice. As someone does critique, a critique is in terms of research, is a process of objectively and critically evaluating a research report's content for scientific merit and application to practice, theory, and education. So what we're seeing, does it make sense? Does it really work? Should we use it? Those are some questions I want to analyze and synthesize for the critical reading. So just not take everything for face value. Go, does this make sense? Are things following? Critiquing criteria, look at standards, questions, evaluating guides, and this can be used to analyze a study. And you want to first read and then go back and read for comprehension. And then also for understanding. It's one thing to just read something, but to really understand it well, really one reading's not going to do. Evidence-based practice, first we ask questions, we gather, assess, appraise, and then act on what we find and finally evaluate, just like the nursing process. To assess and appraise, one wants to consider the quality and the extent of the study, minimizing bias. Quantity, the number of studies. If one research article comes out and says, this is the best practice, but it's really contradictory to everything else that's out there, we kind of want to go, maybe we need to wait till the next study before we start jumping in on that. I want to look at consistencies of the study reports and findings. Are they similar to other ones? Do they make sense? Are they jumping to conclusions within the study, or does it all follow? Those are some kind of things we want to ask ourselves. When you're taking a look at whether you should use some evidence, just some things you need to do. Randomized control trials, so a research study in which they say, we're going to study 1,000 people and we're randomly going to assign some into one group and another group. One group's going to get, for example, maybe a medication, and the other group's going to get a placebo, a sugar pill, and then compare the difference. Those are considered very strong studies, particularly if large numbers of people are used, and it's well controlled. That would be the best. Sometimes there's experiments and maybe people, it's not quite as thorough as the one before. Might not be a variety. Like for the first one, it might have like 5 different centers where all that happened. Number 2 might just have one center in which they do that experiment. A quasi-experimental study usually lacks some control, so there may not be a random control. So they may be and sometimes, that has to happen. You can't, if you want to study, say, for example, something horrible like people's response to a car accident, we can't randomly assign people to be in a car accident and those that not. It's just not ethical, it's not appropriate. So sometimes we find the people that we can, and we use that, and that's okay. Sometimes it just has to happen, but they're not as strong as, for example, the meta-analysis, the number one in many different centers and in huge groups of numbers. Sometimes things are non-experimental just because of the way things happen. You couldn't get readings from the person at the beginning, only at the end of the study. There wasn't randomization, but sometimes, it helps to, for example, put out a survey, what is the nurse's perception of the quality of care at a facility. You know, just a one-time survey, really not experimental. It's not experimental, not doing anything different. We're not randomizing, but it's still helpful to find that information. But it's not as strong as some of the others. Systematic reviews of descriptive and qualitative studies, when people go and look at a variety of studies and say, this is my conclusion from looking at these, and write an article. That, once again, some people wouldn't consider as strong. There's some argument there, though. Descriptive and qualitative studies, many people feel in nursing and other that those studies are not as valuable and maybe not as strong. I know some people who feel qualitative research is actually better than quantitative, and getting description is very helpful. But it is not as scientific, and there's more questions about that. Expert opinion, you know, you can ask a person's opinion, and they might be an expert, but they may not be in agreement with other experts. So once again, a little bit weaker. So as you're looking at research articles, and at this first week you do need to get a research article, things you're going to be looking for as you're researching and reading those is look at the abstract. That's the first part, where it's kind of a quick little summary. Then the introduction, it has usually the research purpose, it has a review of literature and theoretical framework, although a lot of nursing research articles that come out even today do not have theoretical frameworks explicit. They are often in there. Hypotheses and research questions are often in the front part too, but once again you may see that those are missing. Under the methods and design, it usually comes next. There's a sampling. How did they get the people in the study? How was this study performed in terms of how it was designed and implemented? What are the instruments? Did they use a survey, or did they use some sort of equipment? Are they reliable? Are they valid? Are they really studying what they're supposed to study? You should also have data collection process. Who collected the data? You know, what are the specifics of how it was collected and how it was analyzed? Then you'll usually see the results, what was found, and then discussion. So, okay, that's what we found, but what does that mean? Is there an implication for practice and future research? And are there limitations? They really should. Some articles don't, but you know, if they say did a study of 30 people who all maybe had a miscarriage and how they experienced the miscarriage, and they used a survey, you know, the limitation might be all the people were from one hospital in a small community. Might be very different than like a large medical institution in a big city. So they should give some limitations of what the study is, and maybe the tool wasn't as good, things like that. And then finally, references. There should be references, and they should be fairly new if it's a strong study. Like I mentioned before, there are two major methods in terms of research. You'll hear people talking about quantitative and qualitative. Once again, make sure you know the difference between these. This is important in terms of understanding research and applying it. Quantitative is what usually we think about in terms of surveys. They're looking at a specific group of people and how do these people react, what kind of cause and effect things going on. It's usually very objective in terms of people try to get things written and don't put a lot of emotional attachment to it. It might be an instrument or procedure that's used. And usually then what's analyzed is numbers. What is the score on this or that? While qualitative is a broader focus. It's usually more in terms of looking at a process or a lived experience. How do people that are in this kind of place in life feel about something? There's meaning, there's discovery. It's subjective. The researcher usually says and explains their part in the research process. Usually interviews or observations are made with these types of studies. A lot of times it might just be a very non-structured, just a conversation about what happened. But they can also look at journals, and I've done some web page evaluation. So words are the usual analysis and what is studied in these. So here's a quiz. Hypotheses are stated in the article. Which one would you expect of hypotheses? This comes from the reading. We really didn't talk about this specifically. There is quite a bit more in the next lecture. I actually already did the PowerPoint. I thought the next one was the first one, so I already have that up there. And so if it seems a little strange, it's like, why is she talking like this is the first one? That's because I was confused. But we do talk, and you'll hear more about hypotheses and research questions, stuff like that in the next one. So hopefully this is in your reading. Things like reliability, validity, what is a variable. The next one talks quite about the next chapter in the next PowerPoint about independent and dependent variables. So make sure you get the reading done and answer these questions. I'm not going to answer them for you because then it'll kind of help you focus on your learning and your reading to make sure you get these answered. And thanks for your time, and I hope you have learned something, feel a little smarter now that you're done, and have a wonderful week. Bye now.